There's a kind of loneliness that's hard to explain. It's not about being alone, it's not about lacking company. It's about standing in a room full of people and still feeling like you don't belong. You felt it for as long. As you can remember, you were the child who asked questions no one could answer. The one who felt things more deeply than others thought was necessary. The one who noticed patterns, energies, moods, and didn't know how to stop feeling them. Maybe you were told you were too much, or too quiet, or simply different, and after a while you started to believe it, that there must be something wrong with you. But what if being different isn't a flaw? What if it's a signal? Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But becoming who you are often requires separating from who the world told you to be, and that separation can feel like exile, like isolation, like being the outsider again and again. You may have spent your life trying to adjust, trying to fit into systems that never felt quite right. You learned how to play along, how to smile when you were hurting, how to stay quiet when your soul was screaming. You became a master at pretending to belong, while dying inside from the pressure of not being seen. But maybe you were never meant to fit. Maybe your difference is the very thing that's trying to lead you back to your truth. Because what the world calls strange is often just unrecognized brilliance. What others see as too sensitive may be sacred intuition. What feels like isolation may actually be a spiritual invitation to remember who you are beneath the masks. So if you've always felt like the one who doesn't belong, stay with me. Because you're not broken, you're just becoming someone. The world hasn't learned how to understand yet. There's a unique kind of pain that comes from feeling like you never truly belong anywhere. It's not loud, it doesn't always scream, but it's persistent, quiet, like a low vibration that follows you through every room, every group, every season of your life. It begins early. Maybe in childhood, you're surrounded by people, yet something feels off. You laugh with them, but you don't feel fully with them. You sense a distance, a strange invisibility, like you're watching life from behind a pane of glass no one else seems to see. You notice things others don't, the tone behind the words, the discomfort in the silences. You ask bigger questions. Why are we doing this? Why does this matter? But those around you often respond with confusion, annoyance, or silence. So you begin to edit yourself. You learn how to dim your light, simplify your thoughts, suppress your questions, just to feel less strange. Carl Jung believed that the human being is born with the potential for wholeness, but that wholeness often requires differentiation. To become who you are, you must first step away from the collective expectations of who you're supposed to be. And that stepping away, that process of becoming, is often where the feeling of not belonging takes root. You begin to sense that the conversations people have are too shallow. The things they chase feel meaningless. The games they play exhaust you. But instead of recognizing this as spiritual maturity, you assume it must be your failure to adapt. But what if it's not a failure? What if you simply see more? When you're highly intuitive, deeply empathic, or spiritually sensitive, the world can feel too dense, too loud, too artificial. You're not just processing what's happening, you're absorbing what's beneath it. You feel the energy of a room, the wounds people try to hide, the lies they tell themselves. And while others seem perfectly fine, you're left overwhelmed, overstimulated, and utterly alone. This is not dysfunction, it's perception. And the more attuned you become to truth, the less you fit into systems built on illusion. Schools, workplaces, even families, they reward conformity, predictability, performance. But your soul was designed for depth, for authenticity, for meaning. So the more you try to fit in, the more you fracture inside. You start playing roles, becoming who they want you to be, saying what they expect you to say. but your inner world keeps whispering, "This isn't it." Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." That awakening begins with the ache of alienation, with the slow realization that the discomfort isn't because something is wrong with you, but because something deep within you wants to be right. You were not made to be normal. You were made to be real. The pressure to belong often comes with a heavy cost, the abandonment of your authenticity. And for a while you may have paid that price. You may have learned how to pass as ordinary, how to hide your intuition, your insights, your emotions. But the longer you suppress it, the louder the discomfort becomes, because deep down, your soul remembers who you are. It remembers that you were never meant to blend in. You were meant to see through. That's why you feel disconnected. Not because you're distant, but because you're connected to something deeper, something the world has forgotten. You walk through places and feel things you can't explain. You notice the pain in people's eyes even when they're smiling. You feel drained after being in crowds, not because you're antisocial, but because you're absorbing what others ignore. You try to explain this to people, but they don't get it. They call you dramatic, oversensitive, intense, and slowly you stop talking about it altogether. You learn to carry it in silence. But silence doesn't mean absence, it means density. You're not alone because you're empty. You're alone because you're full of perception, of emotion, of truth. And that fullness makes it hard to fit into shallow spaces. So if you've always felt like you're too much for others or not enough to belong, pause for a moment. Because maybe you're not meant to belong to the world as it is. Maybe you're meant to help shape it into something more true. There's a pattern that repeats in the lives of those who feel they don't belong. A quiet exile, a spiritual displacement, a sense of being on the edge of things, watching, sensing, perceiving, while the rest of the world seems absorbed in roles that never quite felt like yours. Carl Jung observed this pattern again and again. He understood that some souls carry what he called an archetypal function, a blueprint of consciousness that moves them through life differently. Among these is the archetype of the outsider. The outsider is not simply someone who feels alone. They are someone who sees differently, and because of that they are often pushed to the margins. But that marginality is not punishment. It's a preparation. The outsider often carries a depth of perception that the collective is not ready to hold. Their presence alone disrupts the norm, confronts the unspoken, and brings light to what others avoid. And in doing so, they make people uncomfortable, not because they are threatening, but because they are true. You may have experienced this. You enter a room and feel like you don't fit the tone. You question things others accept. You find yourself uncomfortable with groupthink, resistant to unspoken rules. You feel like you're always swimming against the current, even if you're not trying to. That's not rebellion. That's integrity. You're not being difficult. You're being called. Jung associated this with what he called the individuation process, the soul's journey back to its essence, away from the mask of the persona and toward the deeper self. And those who go through this journey inevitably face a rupture between the false belonging of the external world and the authentic path that calls from within. The outsider archetype lives in that rupture. They walk alone, not because they don't need others, but because they can no longer betray what they see. You may resonate with other symbolic roles. So too, the wounded healer, the hermit, the seer. These archetypes speak to the path of the soul that's been broken open, not for destruction, but for awakening. The wounded healer is the one who transforms their own pain into medicine. The hermit is the one who withdraws to reconnect with what is real, not to escape, but to return bearing truth. The seer is the one who cannot look away, who notices what's beneath the mask and speaks what others are afraid to say. These archetypes aren't fantasies. They are living energies that shape the paths of people like you, people who've always felt off in ordinary settings, not because something is missing, but because something deeper is present. And the world has always misunderstood those who carry that depth. You've likely been told you're too introspective, too emotional, too sensitive, too intense. But too much often just means more than others are used to. You may have even tried to cut off your difference, tried to fit, tried to become someone easier to digest. But no matter how much you compromise, something inside you refuses to fully blend in. That something is your soul. Carl Jung once said, "The reason for evil in the world is that people are not able to tell their stories." You've lived in silence for too long, carrying a story that few have the capacity to hear. But the purpose of the outsider isn't to be silent. It's to reveal, not to everyone, but to those ready for truth. You are not the problem. You are the mirror, and mirrors are often avoided, not because they're wrong, but because they reflect what's unprocessed in others. Your difference was never about rejection. It was always a recognition of the role you came here to play, not to blend in, but to awaken, not to follow, but to remember. You are here to walk a path others may never understand until they're ready to begin their own. You've spent years trying to silence your difference, trying to dim what made you stand out, trying to be more like them, whoever them was at the time. But no matter how much you tried, the sense of misalignment remained, because your soul never came here to fit in. It came here to embody truth, depth, feeling, presence, and that embodiment will never look like conformity. Carl Jung taught that the self, your truest center, doesn't need validation to be real. It simply needs space to emerge. And when you begin to honor your difference, when you stop fighting your design, that space begins to open. You don't need to become louder to be powerful. You don't need to be understood to be true. Your strength begins with acceptance, not from the outside, but from within. You accept that your sensitivity isn't a weakness. It's a spiritual sense. You accept that your tendency to withdraw isn't avoidance. It's energetic protection. You accept that your longing for meaning isn't unrealistic. It's a soul remembering what most have forgotten. And once you accept it, you begin to build around it. You begin to design your life around your energy, not around the expectations of others. You allow solitude to become sacred. You give yourself permission to say no without explanation. You let silence be your teacher and intuition your compass. You stop chasing what's not aligned and start creating what reflects your truth. You begin to live with presence, and that presence changes things. You don't have to explain your difference anymore. You simply live it, and those who are meant to recognize it will. They'll feel it in your calm, in your clarity, in the way you don't pretend, in the way you hold space without trying to control it. Your energy becomes your language. Your authenticity becomes your magnet. Your very being becomes a kind of quiet revolution, not shouting to change the world, but simply being the part of the world that's already changed. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But he also knew that's where liberation begins. So, if you feel like the different one, maybe that's because you're the first. The first in your family to question old patterns, the first in your circle to seek depth over distraction, the first in your line to walk a spiritual path the world doesn't yet recognize. That's not a burden. It's an assignment. You are not here to play a role. You're here to remember a frequency and live it fully, even if it makes others uncomfortable. Especially then, because your difference holds a vibration. one that disrupts illusion, one that invites truth, one that opens the door for others to begin their own journey home. You don't need a platform. You don't need a title. You just need to be exactly what you are. That is your purpose. You've spent your life feeling like the different one. But now you see, that difference was never a flaw. It was your frequency, your gift, your soul's signature. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And you were becoming. You're not lost, you're aligned. Not strange, but sovereign, not rejected, but redirected. You were never here to belong to the crowd. You were here to awaken yourself, and through that, awaken others. If this spoke to you, right, I was never meant to fit, I was meant to remember.